Okay, welcome back to the discussion on The Shining. In particular, we're continuing part two. And part two of this series, we're breaking down the book. So I'm comparing the book to the film. And for referential purposes, I'm using Stephen King's The Shining. This is a 78 softcover reprint by Signet, I believe is the publisher. And if you're following along and reading along with me as you go through these, or in real time as I'm making them, then that should give you an idea of the page numbers and whatnot to make sure that we're kind of on the same page for what we're looking at. Okay, so normally what I did before when I did Peeling Syd Barrett, when I kind of discussed Syd Barrett in another series, what I would do is I would handle comments and corrections at the very beginning of each episode from the previous episode. So if you have comments or corrections, if you're following along with this, hopefully you've watched the film already and you're reading along with me as you go. Maybe you're ahead, maybe you've made your own notes, I don't know. But throw those together in comments. I enjoy reading those. And from putting together my Peeling Syd series, I recognized that people were finding things that I wasn't finding. And I think that'll happen here too. I think if people kind of go along with me as I'm doing this, they'll see things that I don't see. They'll catch things that I've missed. And they may have just an interesting way of looking at things that I wouldn't have noticed. So hopefully some folks will do that. I don't know. We'll see what happens. So comments and corrections. I don't have any comments, but there were some new subscribers. Thanks for subscribing if you're new. Hopefully you like this discussion or other things on my channel. I do make a lot of different things, so I'll get around to each one of them eventually. Right now I'm trying to focus on the Shining series stuff. So corrections from previous. Okay, I want to make a few notes about things that were discussed in the previous episode. The first thing that I want to discuss is this Gnostic and karmic kind of background that I'm sensing from the source material, not just from the film, but also from the book. Now, I am not an expert on these topics, okay? So please do not think that I'm an expert on these topics. I have a basic feel for some of the points that they make. I have some idea of what karma is, and I have studied some Gnostic philosophy and some Gnostic scripture. So I'll make a suggestion to you that if you are interested in these ideas, in particular Gnosticism, there is a channel devoted to this called the Gnostic Informer. You can check that out. There is another religious discussion channel called Esoterica. And in that particular channel, that individual discusses Valentinian Gnosticism. And they also go through the Apocryphon of John. So these are kind of introductory Gnostic scriptures or material to be considered and read through. And by listening to this person's discussion, you can he's very schooled on these topics, much more so than I am. So if they are interesting to you, I suggest that you check them out. Okay, so another thing that I wanted to bring up was the purple and green problem. Now, in the film, purple and green is accentuated. Now, if you followed the Masque of the Red Death discussion that we had a long time ago, purple and green are identified as rooms, one of the 7 sins. They're obviously correlating to some form of sin. It's not specific what these colors represent. So if you understand colors, you can understand that. Let's just look at green, okay? So in the previous episode, I mentioned green may represent money. That's, in my opinion, that's somewhat unlikely because I can think of something else that's much more negative tied to money. The idea that there is purple and green used in the room for room 217 or room 237 in the film is very likely tied to the woman that's passed away that's staying in the room. So what qualities does that woman have? It's intimated that not only is she kind of upper society, whatever, and that she had money, but also that her marriage was failing. And in the film, she seems to be kind of a wanton lady. So we assume that the old lady maybe is not the same as the young lady, but she may be. And if that's the case, then she may have a past, and that past may be tied to being like a lady of the night or whatever. So So the colors green and purple in that case may represent the negative side of fertility, if you follow what I'm saying. So green is commonly associated with fertility because of the green colors of plants. And if so, then that would make sense. That's a negative side of fertility, is to kind of be a lady of the night, or to be selling yourself for money, basically. Now, the color purple then obviously could be a representation, as Stephen King used in his book, of something that's rotting, like rotting meat was often called purple. There was a gang, I believe, out of Detroit called the Purple Gang, and they called themselves purple for that same reason. What I feel is the more likely connection to purple is that purple is a royal color. This was the case for a long time because the color purple was so expensive, purple dye. And so you had an entire culture or civilization built on the trade of many things, but among them the color purple, which was tied to the Phoenicians and eventually to Carthage as well. So the color purple obviously can represent status or pride. So in that case, then perhaps we have two of the sins, pride and greed or lust, that are all wound up together in the colors purple and green. Okay? I don't know exactly what's going on there, but if I had to guess, that's kind of what I would suspect is happening in the film's version of Room 237. Okay? One more thing to discuss before I get started here is I discuss the nature of 217 and how that can represent something negative. The idea of two people becoming one in marriage in service to sin. Now, obviously 217 can be very positive idea. The idea of two people becoming one in kind of mindset in service to virtue could also be represented by the number 217. But clearly that's not what's happening in the book and in the film. What's happening in the book and in the film, in my opinion, is two people becoming one in marriage as kind of a union, but it's damaged. And it's not fully kind of a fully formed union of whole individuals. These individuals are both damaged goods. And so quite often you'll have two people that are looking to fulfill themselves through someone else who also is damaged. And that negative form of union is not always doomed to fail, but it's in my opinion more likely to fail. So ideally what you would have is two whole people who come together and agree upon things and kind of work through stuff. The same way that we talk with ourselves in our head, we would talk with the other person and form a full union that is engaged in a constant process of review, rebuke, consideration, sacrifice of self, but also a recognition that the other person is going to meet us kind of halfway. And then that form of union is more likely to be positive in the end and in service to the virtues, the 7 virtues. Just my opinion. Anyway, so that's all from the previous episode. And what I'd like to do now is just go ahead and get started on some of the previous things that we had discussed. Okay? So let's go ahead and get back to our discussion of the book. We left off at about page 37. I'm actually, chapter 5. So we're starting off at chapter 5, phone booth. Now the first note that I have is on page 37. And the reason I have this is that we find out that a few things about Jack. The first thing is that Jack had to submit his resignation, and he was almost about to get tenure, which is really big for teachers, of course. Tenure protects you from a lot of negative things, such as the potential of being fired. So he would have been a tenured teacher, but because he had attacked a student in a fit of anger, he lost his job. So that indicates someone who's not able to control himself, among other things. Another thing that's on page 37 is we find out that Jack kind of was spiraling into depression, and he was going to a bar, and specifically it states that he was going to a bar where dark shadows were at, and they were drinking the tasty waters of oblivion. Okay, so this is very similar to the Gold Room in the film. Jack is going there to kind of wallow in his depression, and there are shadowy figures there, and specifically dark shadows are mentioned here in the book. Now, in the film, they're not shown as dark shadows. They're shown as like this kind of happy-go-lucky, happy place. But the truth is that they're very likely ghosts. And for that reason, they are dark shadows. They're just not appearing that way to Jack Torrance in the film. Let's continue on. Anyway, that's of note to me because this is kind of the process of what Jack is doing when he's spiraling in the hotel in the film. Confirmed here on page 37. Okay, page 39. And again, just to reiterate this, this is kind of a synthesis of ideas from the book and the film that is not direct. So it's a slight variation of the book that is included in the film in a new way. Who is doing that? And by the way, one more correction that I would just like to kind of point out. I believe clearly that The Shining is a work of genius. Now, it would be very easy to be like everyone else and just worship Kubrick. But the truth is, when I get into the film, you're going to see that there are so many people contributing to this film to make it wonderful. And I just want to point out that there is a woman, at least one woman of genius, in my opinion, that's involved in this film that gets almost no credit. And in this case, one of the writers was a co-author of this script, and her name is Diane Johnson. And I'll discuss her more later on when I get into the film. But people constantly overlook this woman. And it's a little bit disconcerting because she is an individual of genius and extraordinary capability. And I don't know. It's disappointing. I can't talk about her yet because she's not involved with the book. But when I get to the film, I'm going to discuss this lady, Diane Johnson. And I think you're going to find out that very likely the complexity of this film is tied to a number of things linked to her. In the same way, let's remember now that Stephen King wrote his book Carrie, and his wife saved that book, and that really was his breakthrough, and she helped him write it. So the complexities of this family and the complexities of the character, Wendy Torrance, are almost certainly tied to the contributions of the co-author. Okay, I just want to point that out. Okay, so let's continue on. I'm on page 39. I don't want to dwell on something for too long, but whatever. So page 39, we find out that there's an accident. So Jack is driving. He's been drinking, and he's with his friend Al. Okay, and him and Al is the one that eventually gets him the job at the Overlook, or helps get him the job at the Overlook anyway. They're out driving and they hit a bike that's just kind of in the middle of the road. They get out and they look all around for whoever's been riding it, but they can't find anyone that's actually like laying on the side of the road injured or anything. They can't find anyone. They didn't see anyone. It's a very strange kind of a interaction, and I don't know exactly what to make of that. It's kind of a strange story. I don't like this chapter very much because I don't know what to make of it. But I will say this, okay? I will say this. One of the theories, and there are many theories that are out there for The Shining. One of the theories is that there are two separate Jack Torrances in the film. And another theory is that there is a very strong link between, and we've discussed this, a very strong link between Jack and his son, Danny. Now, if Danny does have the ability to shine, in the book, Jack Torrance seems to have the ability to eliminate shine, or to be dark, or to be surrounded by shadows. So it's almost like you have a conflict of two poles, like a negative and a positive charge. One person, the son, who's using his shining ability to for positive actions and for positive outcomes, and a father, Jack Torrance, who seems to be using a similar ability but in a negative way to create shadows around himself and to create negative outcomes for himself and his family, and is overcome with negative emotions. And Danny Torrance is trying to have positive emotions. So we assume that in the film that Danny is the only one that really is shining. But as we'll find out later on when Danny's talking with Mr. Halloran says quite a few people actually are able to shine. And it's quite likely that Jack is a negative form of shine. I don't know what you would call that. Okay, my next note is Night Thoughts, Chapter 6. I'm just going to go ahead and skip ahead to that. So here we have a chapter that starts off with Wendy Torrance's point of view. And in particular, she wakes up with her man, who's Jack Torrance, of course, next to her, and she's quite happy and satisfied that he is there with her. Now, they mentioned that she's happy that apparently they've had intercourse, and that brings out a sense of togetherness with her. And I'm pointing this out because in the film, there's almost no connection between Jack Torrance and Wendy Torrance. The only time that I really see them show affection is kind of when they're walking around together as part of the introduction to the Overlook. I think they hold hands once. That's the only time you really see them showing affection towards one another, which is unfortunate. But here in the book, you can see they actually are quite affectionate to one another. Again, now, Stephen King did not like the representation of certain things in the film. And one of them that he complained about was that Jack Torrance in the film seems to be wholly negative, and in the book he's not. And here is an example of this particular interaction between the two of them. They do have affection. They do like one another. Okay, so let's look at the next point, which is that at the bottom of that page 45, there's a statement here that Wendy Torrance is finally able to break away from her mother, and Jack is the one who had helped to break her away from her mother. So there's kind of an indication that that Wendy Torrance's relationship with her mother wasn't really very positive. Although she does support her daughter, it doesn't seem to be a really nurturing kind of a relationship. So I'm bringing this up because, as we just mentioned, the number 217. So when you have two damaged individuals who are kind of rushing to a union with one another and hoping to find fulfillment through that union or through the other person, it's much more likely that they're going to struggle. And in this case, we find out that Wendy's background is somewhat negative because she isn't from a very nurturing family. And I believe her parents had both split. So this is fairly common now. You can come from a family that's entirely together but still dysfunctional. That's still possible. But the dysfunctionality is specifically cited here by Mr. King and Wendy Torrance's background. I don't really remember him discussing too much of Jack's background. At any rate, as I said, one of the things that people discuss is the Wendy theory. So we've already discussed one aspect of Wendy, in my opinion, that's kind of questionable, and that is that Danny's just kind of waiting outside by himself for his dad to get home, which is kind of an indicator to me that he's not being watched very well. And I'm just going to add these up as we go along, but here is another example to back up the Wendy theory, and that is that Wendy's family seems to be somewhat dysfunctional. And that dysfunctionality, of course, doesn't just disappear. It's something someone has to fix. Hopefully not on their own, but many people do end up having to fix that on their own. And if they're able to do so, then they'll be able to live a more balanced life, in my opinion. So let's move on to the next point that I would like to make on page 46. So essentially what happens is Jack kind of suggests that, he asks if she's been to see her father. And she had, and she kind of was surprised that he would know that. And there's italics, and it says kind of along the lines of, she's wondering how would he know that? And the answer is in italics, the shadow knows. So there again is an indicator that Jack is able to kind of utilize some kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, psychic energy or knowledge he has some form of spiritual energy, but it's coming from a negative place. That's indicated right there. Again, there's a mention made of shadows, the opposite of light. Okay, the next point that we have is that we find out that on the bottom of page 46, Wendy had gotten a job. Jack had helped to get her a job where she was typing. Okay, why do I mention this? Well, in the next page, it continues on. Not only is she typing, but she's typing a story for someone that's unsuccessful. So it's an unsuccessful novel. Okay, now this is, of course, noteworthy because during the film, Jack Torrance is typing all the time. But there's nothing in this book stating that he knows how to type. He may be an author and he may know how to write, and this would seem, I guess, surprising to some people. But I just want to point out that before, people would write things out longhand. You know, they would write them out longhand, shorthand, however, and then they often would give them to someone else to type for them. Not always, but it did happen. It was much more common for people previously to write out things longhand. And we assume from the film that Jack can type. But there's nothing in this book saying he can type. And if you are a believer in the Wendy theory, that would indicate, and some people have mentioned this, that there is a scene where Wendy seems to be coming up out of the typewriter, that she is the one that's actually writing the story. So here's another point now, and I'll just keep track of these as we go. Here's another point that indicates that it is possible that Wendy might be the one typing. And the fact that it's an unsuccessful novel kind of indicates that it's garbage. And of course, that's what Jack is typing in the film. He's typing garbage. So, just a thought. If you're inclined to consider the nature of those different theories. Okay, the next point that I want to point out to you is on page 47. At the bottom of the page, we find out that although Jack is an English major, Wendy is actually a sociologist. So she does have a background and she does have a degree. This is noteworthy for a couple of reasons, not least of which Mr. King's mother was a sociologist or a social worker, as we discussed in our previous episode. And you have to ask yourself now, if she is a sociologist, she has to be fully aware of what's happening with her family. You would think, right? I mean, I would. If someone is from that type of background, they would be surrounded with the negativity of the things that are happening to them. If they choose not to see them, then at some point you have to say, are they not really knowledgeable in the area that they studied? I mean, all these negative behaviors displayed by her husband, she has to be aware of where they're going to. And if he is abusive and angry, and she sees that, but pretends, I guess, like maybe things will get better because there are some good times, then she also is kind of like the husband in that she's generating darkness, obscuring the facts from herself because the facts are maybe painful to deal with, or, you know, people are afraid sometimes to confront the truth. But it's quite clear that due to her background, she should know what the dynamic is, and it's a negative dynamic. And in the book, to be fair, she is contemplating divorce and whatnot. And she's considering it. So you see that she is actually considering taking some form of action. So on the next point I would like to make is at the top of page 49. We find out that Jack's been out drinking and that he was trying to soothe the baby when he got home and he dropped him on the floor. Okay, so we'll find out later on this is a repeat of another activity. So in this way, this careless type of behavior, which is indicative of someone who's an idiot, frankly. I don't know what else to call it. I don't know what to... I don't know what you would call a man that has a baby that would go out drinking and they would come home and pick up the baby while they're drunk and handle it in a haphazard fashion and then drop it on the floor. That's an idiot to me. I don't know what to call that. Anyway, let's continue on. Bottom of page 49, we find out that Jack is sitting at a table. He's kind of pallid, etc., and he has a cigarette jittering between his fingers. Okay, bottom of page 49. So right there, we find out that Jack smokes. This again does not support the film. Jack is never shown smoking in the film. Wendy is. So here again is another point that backs up the Wendy theory, that Wendy is the one showing smoking in the film for some reason. Now you can take it as far as you want to go. You can say that, well, perhaps we've identified Jack as a smoker, and we've identified that he has problems. You can call it sin, you can call it whatever you want. I don't care, but we know he has problems, okay? Okay, so what is the point of all this? Well, the point is possibly just quite simple. That in the film they wanted to balance out the characters and show that they're both capable of positive and negative. So Jack is a drunk, and maybe Wendy has an addiction too, and her addiction maybe is smoking. So in that way you kind of balance the characters. Maybe Jack has some darkness to him, and Wendy has darkness to her too. Whether hers is recessive and dark and hidden, and his is proactive and dark and hidden. They're both not fully capable individuals. They're both damaged goods, and they're in a bad marriage. So in that way, the film kind of balances them out better. And in the book, now this is another sin for Jack, that he's actually a smoker. Now there is another aspect to smoking, particularly in women. I don't know all the numbers for these, but I'm willing to bet you that smoking was never as popular amongst women in the United States as it was for men. I'm willing to bet that. I'm also willing to bet that culturally, a woman that smoked had a kind of a reputation socially, and that was that she was kind of a rebel. So smoking and being cool and being a rebel thing has always been an aspect of the United States subculture. But amongst women, it's even more so. And there is a kind of an indicator amongst women that are willing to smoke in the United States that there also is a kind of there's a sexual aspect to it as well that goes beyond what it is just for men. For men, it's like you're a tough guy and whatever else. But for women that smoke, historically in the United States, just my opinion now. I mean, you can have your own opinion, but there's always been this kind of maybe she's a little bit wild kind of aspect to beyond rebellion now, and this would have to do with women that are viewed to be a little bit more sexually active, let's say. Okay, let's continue on. The next point that I would like to make, and again, now that's a difference, and if you're following along to the Wendy theory, there's another quality in the book that's tied to Jack, but in the film it's actually given to Wendy. Okay? That she's smoking and not Jack. And I'll just point out in the film that when she's shown smoking, she's reading a very controversial book. Okay? And I'll get into that later when we get into the film, because that book is not in here at all. Okay, so the next point that I would like to make is that on the top of page 51, we find out that not only is Jack a lush and a drunk, but his writing also is pretty bad. So here's another reference to just bad writing. Someone who's not capable as an author, or perhaps maybe he had been at one point, but he's not anymore. So that would tie in pretty well with the film, in my opinion, that Jack is just not really there as a writer. Now, at the bottom of that page, page 51, we find out that Jack makes a significant change to his life. He goes dry. So he's hanging out with Al, his friend Al, and he's not drinking at all anymore, which is a very significant change. And perhaps that's the reason that Wendy decides that she'll continue to try to stay with him, which I guess makes sense. I mean, if someone makes a large mistake in a union and they're willing to change, then you have to wonder if it's maybe it's salvageable. So that would make things a little bit more understandable from her point of view. The next point I would like to make is on page 52. Now this is important. This is very important. Okay. Now we find out that when the baby was born, Wendy looks at the baby's face, and she sees in italics that the baby has no face. Now, this is incredibly strange, and I just want to point out again that dysfunctionality and perhaps forms of mental illness can run in families. So some people believe that this entire film is about mental illness. I haven't seen anybody really try to break that down, but clearly, I mean, this she looks and she sees that her own child doesn't have a face, but then she looks back again and he does. So what exactly is going on there? There again is another point in this book that can support the Wendy theory that she is not mentally or emotionally stable, and she has not been for a long time. This is kind of having hallucinations like this is something that's tied often with certain mental instabilities like schizophrenia or psychopathy. So right there in the book is a point that supports the Wendy theory, in spite of what some people might say. It is possible that she is deeply flawed. Okay, let's move on. The next point that I would like to kind of discuss, and there, of course, there's the reason why the face on the cover of this soft cover does not, or the child's head doesn't have a face. That's the reason. It's specifically pointing to this particular instance. And of course, I mean, that might just be included by the author to kind of freak you out, right? Like, what's going on there? Why is that's kind of strange? A lot of people have a fear that they will give birth to a child that's a little bit strange. I think that's fairly common in parents that as we go through the process, we're worried about the health of the mother, but also the health of the child. Whether or not the child will be born abnormally, will they have visual defects, will they be mentally, will they have mental problems that they'll have to overcome, will there be other issues that, and of course some people think this is a very selfish line of thought, but in my opinion it's not. You can look at these things and say, what can we expect the future of our life to be like? And if a person has a child that has additional difficulties to overcome, that is going to be more of a load on the entire family to try to assist this child that of course they're going to love, but they also have to basically care for. And how are they going to be able to do that? And will they be able to do it successfully? There's always that question, I believe, amongst men and women. Will they be able to successfully provide for their own children? That's a great fear. And of course, if the child has problems, that fear is greater because the parent inherently knows that the child is going to need more to be successful. And they'll face many more difficulties. And maybe those difficulties are going to be that they're ridiculed by other kids at school. And they'll have to deal with more heartache. And of course, that's hard for everyone involved. Anyway, digressing again. So let's continue on. The next point I would like to make is on page 53. We find out that in italics, maybe third paragraph, and previous to that, Danny seems to know that his dad has been in some form of an accident. Again, maybe it's psychic abilities. Maybe it's pointing to the fact that the father and the son are connected in a way. Are they just good friends? Are they connected spiritually somehow by being father and son? I'm sure a lot of people have opinions about that, but whatever. The bond is indicated there. The next point I would like to make, continuing on that page, we find out that Wendy's struck by the connection between her father and son, between Jack, the father, and the son. And perhaps this is part of the reason why she's reluctant to get divorced, because she knows the negative impact that'll have on her son. Again, kind of explaining one of her fears. The next point is on page 54. She specifically says that their three oneness might be destroyed. So that's a fear of hers, that the three of them were kind of welded together. So there's our connection there between the number 3 and 1, but that they were connected and that their three oneness might be destroyed. Now, of course, the number 3 is an ideal number. I haven't gone into the number 3 too much. Obviously, the number room 237 does use the number 3, but the book does not. It uses 217. The number 3 often is used to represent family, and the reason for that should be quite obvious. You have a father, a mother, and a child. That's or two parents and a child, if you prefer to use that. But the number 3 also is tied, of course, to very religious and spiritual ideas, because it's tied to the Holy Trinity. And and the Holy Trinity, in my opinion, okay, just my opinion, it's tied to much older ideas, and it's very common amongst many cultures. The legends, Egyptian mythology, the Great Father, the Great Mother, and then Horus, the son, right? So you have Osiris, Isis, and Horus, I believe. The father, the mother, and the son. The father who goes through all these difficulties and then is brought back from the dead, from the land of the dead, by help of the mother, and Horus, who is his avenging son, etc. Okay, so the number 3 in that case is inherently tied to the idea of family. Let's continue on. The next point that I would like to kind of throw at you is on page 57. Now, in this case, Danny's kind of having bad dreams, and there's someone chasing him and threatening him, saying they're going to find him. He's kind of talking with his invisible friend Tony. And here is the flashing in red rum at the very end of this chapter, this brief chapter. Specifically use red rum. And of course, we know that red rum is just murder backwards. Okay, so let's continue on. I have a few notes here, but I won't get into it too much. I think that pretty much summarizes what I want to look at. Okay, so let's look at page 61. Here's my next note. This is the beginning of chapter 8. I don't know how far we're going to get before we get to our 1 hour time frame. Now, if I actually finish this, then maybe we'll be done for our 1 hour. Okay, so on page 61, we find out that that they're taking the Volkswagen up to the Overlook, and Wendy Torrance is wearing a blue dress, and Danny really likes that dress. He thinks it's her prettiest dress, and his dad is constantly like trying to put his hands on her legs and set her in there laughing and kind of trying to get away, etc. So there we have an indicator again of attraction dynamic between the mother and the father, Jack and Wendy Torrance, in the book, that is specifically not in the film. And in the film, by the way, Shelley Duvall specifically says she was instructed that there would be no friendliness between her and Jack throughout the movie, which is a little odd, of course, because that would be maybe if you're interested in the development of characters, you would want to have some form of connection to everyone that's struggling. But in the film, Jack is always kind of remote and emotionally unavailable. And as Stephen King would say, he's negative from the beginning of the film. It's hard to disagree with that. And here's another example of Stephen King doing the opposite, making you feel like Jack and Wendy maybe have a chance and that they might actually have aspects to them that are positive as a married couple. Now, one thing I will kind of point out is that she's wearing a blue dress. Now, this is opposite, of course, of wearing a red dress, right? So the wearing of a red dress is a woman who is just absolutely exuding femininity. Yet here is a woman who's wearing a blue dress, and there are many examples of this. So if you take a look at, for example, another great film, A Wizard of Oz, Dorothy is wearing a blue dress. Why is she wearing a blue dress? Because it is not a woman who is... it's basically a symbol of modesty. Someone who's true blue, someone who is not kind of showing the world their femininity. And as we'll find out as we kind of read through this, Wendy Torrance actually is quite attractive in the book, and she's hiding it. She's modest, which is what many people would consider to be an ideal wife, or a trait for an ideal wife, traditionally, from a male point of view. Okay, so the next point is on page 62. We find out they're kind of looking at things, and Wendy has kind of an unhappy foreboding, and she is considering the Donner Party. Now, there's no discussion with this, and there's no lead-in. So why is she considering the Donner Party? Now, part of Mr. Rob Ager's argument is that Jack Torrance seems to be exulting in this Donner Party thing, but he really doesn't have anything to say about it. It's entirely tied to Wendy Torrance here in the book, and it's going to be repeated. So again, this is more information that indicates that Wendy is mentally unstable, and it backs the Wendy theory. Okay? Let's continue on. On page 63, she asks whether or not the larder is fully stocked. So she's worried about food. She doesn't mention that she's thinking of the Donner Party, but it specifically says that she is thinking of the Donner Party. Okay? Now, again, Jack doesn't really have much of a response to this point because he still doesn't understand what she's worried about, that she's worried about running out of food. Okay, on the bottom of page 63, Wendy, they get out, they're kind of looking around, and she kind of seems to see her own self plunging down and down and down this large fall with a scream drifting from the mouth. And so she seems to be visualizing herself falling. Now, again, here's another negative thing that she seems to be, I don't know what you would say, imagining. Perhaps it's tied to the ability to shine. So why does she have all these concerns? Maybe it's because, as Mr. Holleran says later, most mothers have the ability to shine. That's what he says in the book. And so perhaps she's seeing these things because she's connected to fear and anxiety and darkness through her negative husband. Maybe that's what's going on. Maybe it's intrinsically her. Maybe it's being channeled, pulled away from him, and it's affecting her. Hard to say. They don't really say in the book, but in my opinion, that's either one of those could be happening. Okay, the next point that I would like to make is also on page 64. And we find out that Wendy is kind of looking at the overlook, and she sees the westward looking windows, and they're reflecting the sun. So there again is the idea of the mirror and the sun, and the reference to the west, of course, which also is negative, because the west is tied to the dying of the sun, the dying of the light, or sunset, which you can call whatever you like, but it is essentially tied to the end of the sun, the end of the day. We find out kind of the looks of Winifred, or Wendy. We find out that her name is Winifred. I don't know if she's previously called Winifred. This is all on page 65, the beginning of chapter 9. Now, the author, Stephen King, clearly states that she has golden hair spilling across her shoulders in her blue dress. So we find out that she's fairly attractive, that she has good legs, or that you didn't have to see them because she's kind of wearing a modest dress to know that she would have good legs. But she does not have black hair. And of course, in the film, she does have black hair. Now, why might this be the case? Well, it's possible, of course, that they wanted Shelley Duvall to play the part, and Shelley Duvall is naturally black-haired. I don't know. I'm assuming she didn't dye her hair for the role. I believe she has dark hair. Now, if not, then you have to really ask, why in the film does Wendy have black hair when in the book she has blonde hair? There is an indicator earlier in the film as to why this might be happening. And I'll kind of... There's more than one theory. One is that Wendy is kind of has a look and is wearing certain clothes because they may be tied to Native Americans, and that would indicate kind of a national role in the mistreatment of Native Americans, and that's why she kind of has that look. Definitely possible. Maybe more than one thing is happening at one time. What I will say is that, in my opinion, it's very likely that Wendy Torrance has black hair because Snow White had black hair. And of course, if you're familiar with, and this is one of the points that collative learning has kind of put together about the Dopey sticker changing. At first it's there and then it's gone. Dopey is, of course, one of the dwarves, although he's not a dwarf. I'll get into this more later when I discuss the film, because none of this is in the book. Okay? This is all just in the film. The only thing that's in the book here is that she's supposed to be blonde. And now we have a differentiation that she has black hair. Why might that be the case? Well, for one thing, Snow White wears a blue dress. For another thing, Snow White has black hair. And she has light skin. And so you have and there's the Dopey sticker. So you have to wonder, is there some kind of a conversation happening there that we are not aware of, and what might that be? I don't want to get into it too much, okay? I'll just say that this might all be tied to Snow White. And later on, when I discuss the film, I'm going to jump into it a little bit more, okay? That's not very rewarding as an explanation to this point in time, but the look is the look there appears to potentially be on purpose. One thing always could just be a coincidence. Once I see two or three things, it's a pattern to me. So I have two references there potentially to Snow White, and I'll discuss why that may be happening when we get to this a little bit later on. Okay. The next point that I would like to discuss is on page 66. On page 66, we begin some of the product placement. So there's so much product placement. It's almost like a commercial in the film, where they're showing all these different brands of things that are in the that are being stocked. But here in the book is the same kind of process. On this page and continue to the next page, there's a customer that's kind of an older lady, and as she's mentioning the difficulty she's having in paying with her American Express card, and Ullman kind of goes to resolve that. But there is a specific product placement, and because of all the products that are placed in the film, and also because of the constant references to cartoons, we have all these references to television, and what might that be associated with? Well, I don't know why Stephen King is doing it, but certainly this is a warning in the film of the impact of television. And of course, Mr. Kubrick had done 2001: A Space Odyssey. So perhaps that the large icon that's used as a vertical versus a horizontal television that ties in with people evolving in some way, I guess you could say, evolving or devolving. It's up to you how you want to call it. But this product placement tied to television and the cartoon references seem to be pointing at some kind of a theme. And that theme likely is the negative impact of television and other things on families, and how all of this is tied together with consumerism. Okay, the next point that I would like to make is on page 68, we find out about this kind of, not only do we find out about the rope court, but also the hedgerow. And this hedgerow has a series of animals, and let's kind of point out what they are. A rabbit, a dog, a horse, a cow, and some that look like lions. So there's 3 lions. Now, why specifically are these animals kind of called out? I don't know. That's the bottom line. You know, why are these animals being called out specifically? A rabbit, a dog, a horse, a cow, and lions. It doesn't really seem to make sense. The lions don't really seem to fit. The rest of them are all kind of domestic or regular animals, but why lions? A lion is kind of a strange animal to get your head around, symbolically. But I will say that it's possible, and I'll get into this a little bit later on when we deal with one other animal a little bit later in the book. But the lion could, of course, it often is representative of spiritual matters because the color of the lion is gold or yellow, and that usually has relation to the sun, and for that reason, for many religions or for many cultures, the color yellow and gold are tied to the sun, and for that reason, a lion is often considered to be a solar animal, if you follow what I'm saying. I don't know why that's in there like that, but I'll just kind of point it out. The next point that I would like to kind of discuss is that on page 69, the animals seem to be moving. Now, Watson had said apparently to Jack previously that the animals seem to creep, which doesn't make sense, of course, they're just hedge animals. But Danny seems to notice that his dad is kind of considering something and asks him about what's going on, and Jack kind of snaps out of it and talks with his son. So now again, there's no labyrinth in the book. It's just these strange hedgerow animals. Now in the actual hotel that they stay in, there are like a bunch of bushes and stuff out in front, the decorative bushes, like a kind of almost like a little park area that's out in front of the hotel, and perhaps that was the inspiration for the hedgerow animals. But in my opinion, the film, of course, uses a labyrinth, a maze, which is a far superior symbol. The last thing that I would like to point out from this chapter is on page 70. And on this page, we find out that Danny kind of listens into the lady that's, she's called Mrs. Brandt, I believe. Now, she sees someone who appears to be a captain in the army, and she has a thought that Danny reads, and that thought is that she would like to get into his pants, that referring to the individual from the army. So now Danny, of course, doesn't really understand exactly what that means. We'll discuss that a little bit more. But again, here's a reference to kind of, I don't know what to call this type of behavior, just unbecoming behavior. Imagine being actually able to read other people's thoughts. And I mean, they say some people are consistently considering intercourse as a matter of who they are. But, I mean, everyone has intrusive thoughts, but these are being stated over and over again, probably for a reason. And we know now the reason that this sexuality is constantly being referenced is because it plays a large part in the Masque of the Red Death. It makes us uneasy to some degree, and that's the likely reason why Mr. King is doing it. Now that particular scene is not in the film. There are other things that kind of are going on in the film instead. At any rate, I guess that's pretty much it for today. That should take us pretty close to an hour. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion, and I hope you're reading along. If you have any comments or you think I missed anything or you want to discuss anything further, just let me know in comments, and I'll try to discuss things as best as I can. And if you have feedback or other things that you would like to see discussed, let me know. If you have comments, or you think I made mistakes, let me know, and I'll include them. And I guess that's pretty much it. Hope you enjoyed this episode. I'll talk to you later.